How does global debt actually work? How can every major nation owe trillions while the economy keeps running? And who exactly holds $317 trillion in debt? Right now in 2026, the numbers are mind-bending. The United States owes $36 trillion. China owes $15 trillion. Japan owes $10 trillion. Every major nation on earth is swimming in debt while insisting everything is fine. Total global debt has reached $317 trillion. That's 330% of global GDP. We'd need 3 full years of global output with zero consumption just to pay it off. No food, no housing, no Netflix, which is 3 years of everyone working for free to pay off debt. But here's the question nobody asks. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Because debt is a zero-sum game. For every borrower, there's a lender. If global debt is $317 trillion, someone owns $317 trillion in global assets. Who? The answer reveals the largest wealth concentration mechanism in human history, through a system where the many borrow and the few lend, where interest compounds forever, and where debt mathematically cannot be repaid, so it grows perpetually while funneling wealth upward. If you want to understand how the real economy works behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Here's what we're covering today. Who actually holds the $317 trillion in global debt? How the system creates debt without creating money to repay it? Why this is intentional design, not accidental crisis? And why the system must eventually face a reckoning. Before we identify who holds the debt, you need to understand what debt actually is in the modern system. Most people think debt works like personal borrowing. You borrow $10,000 from a bank that had $10,000 sitting in a vault. Simple, right? This is not how modern debt works. When a government borrows money by issuing bonds, the money doesn't exist before the borrowing. The act of borrowing creates the money. The central bank or commercial banks buy the government bonds by creating money from nothing through ledger entries. Here's a real example. The US government needs $1 trillion. It issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve announces it will buy $500 billion. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion? It doesn't have it. It creates the money by typing numbers into a computer. Someone literally types numbers into a system. But here's the critical part that breaks the whole system. Only the principal is created. The interest is not created. If the government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, it must repay $1 trillion plus $50 billion in interest per year. But only $1 trillion was created. The $50 billion to pay interest must come from somewhere else. From future borrowing or from taxing the existing money supply. This creates a mathematical trap. Total debt always exceeds total money supply because interest is owed on debt but was never created. The system requires perpetual growth in debt just to serve as existing debt. This is not a bug. This is the design. Now let me show you who holds the debt. The answer is 4 categories of creditors: central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. First, central banks. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in US government debt. The Bank of Japan holds $5 trillion. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion. Central banks globally hold approximately $25 trillion in government bonds. That's 8% of total debt. But who owns the central banks? The Federal Reserve is not government-owned. It's a private institution owned by member banks. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo receive a 6% annual dividend on their Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in government bonds and receives interest, that interest ultimately flows to the private banks that own the Federal Reserve. Second, institutional investors. Pension funds hold $40 trillion in global debt. Insurance companies hold $30 trillion. Mutual funds hold $25 trillion. Hedge funds hold $15 trillion. Institutional investors hold approximately $140 trillion. That's 44%. BlackRock manages $10 trillion in assets. Vanguard manages $8 trillion. State Street manages $4 trillion. These firms alone control $26 trillion in assets. They are the largest shareholders in almost every major corporation and hold massive positions in government bonds. If you're finding this valuable, drop a like to help others discover this. When BlackRock holds $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds, it receives interest payments funded by US taxpayers. The institutional investors are not neutral intermediaries. They are the primary beneficiaries of the debt system. Third, foreign governments. China holds $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds. Japan holds $1.1 trillion. Foreign governments hold approximately $30 trillion globally. That's 9% of total debt. China accumulated US Treasury bonds by running trade surpluses with the United States. This creates dependency. The US needs China to keep buying its debt. China needs the US to keep buying its exports. The debt relationship binds the two economies together. Fourth, wealthy individuals. Ultra-high net worth individuals hold approximately $12 trillion in direct debt holdings. Family offices hold another $10 trillion. This is 7% of total debt. But the wealthy don't just hold debt directly. They own the institutions that hold debt. The largest shareholders of BlackRock are Vanguard and State Street. The three largest asset managers in the world own each other, and they are ultimately controlled by a small number of wealthy families and individuals. When you trace ownership through layers of holding companies and trusts, you find that a few thousand individuals control the majority of the 317 trillion in global debt assets. Few thousand sounds like a lot until you remember there are 8 billion people on Earth. Let's add it up. Central banks hold 25 trillion. Institutional investors hold 140 trillion. Foreign governments hold 30 trillion. Wealthy individuals hold 22 trillion directly. That's 217 trillion. The remaining 100 trillion is fragmented across billions of people. The 217 trillion is concentrated in the hands of a few thousand institutions and individuals. This is the wealth concentration mechanism. The many borrow, the few lend. Interest flows from the many to the few perpetually. Here's why the system is designed this way. Debt creates dependency. When a government is in debt, it cannot make decisions that anger its creditors. Debt creates control without visible coercion. Debt creates inflation. When central banks create money to buy government bonds, the money supply increases. Inflation erodes the value of cash savings held by ordinary people, but it doesn't erode the value of assets held by the wealthy. The wealthy hold assets that rise with inflation. The poor hold cash that loses value. Debt transfers wealth through interest. The US paid $640 billion in interest in 2025. That money comes from taxes paid by working people. It goes to bondholders. It's a direct transfer of wealth from the many to the few, every single year. And debt ensures perpetual growth of the financial sector. The financial sector has grown from 4% of the US economy in 1982, over 8% in 2026. So why does the system persist? Because the system is designed to make borrowing necessary. Governments spend more than they collect in taxes because voters demand services but resist taxes. The gap is filled by borrowing. But it's deeper than that. The monetary system itself requires perpetual debt growth. Money is created through debt. If debt stopped growing, the money supply would contract. Economic activity would collapse. The system is trapped in a cycle where stopping means crashing. This is why central banks panicked in 2020. The Federal Reserve created $4 trillion in new money in a single year to prevent debt defaults that would collapse the financial system. The system must keep debt growing or it collapses. But perpetual debt growth is mathematically impossible in a finite world. Eventually, debt service consumes all economic output. Eventually, the system breaks. We're seeing the early signs now. Interest payments are the fastest growing part of government budgets. The US now spends more on interest than on defense. Debt service is crowding out everything else. More countries are struggling to roll over debt. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022. Pakistan nearly defaulted in 2023. More will follow. Central banks are trapped between inflation and deflation. If they raise interest rates to fight inflation, debt service costs explode. If they lower interest rates to help borrowers, inflation accelerates. There's no good option. The wealthy are preparing. Gold holdings by billionaires have increased 40% since 2020. Farmland purchases have doubled. Private islands, luxury bunkers, citizenship in multiple countries. When the people with the most information start building bunkers, that's usually a sign to what happens next. 3 possible scenarios. Controlled inflation, where governments deliberately inflate away the debt. Creditors lose wealth, but ordinary people holding cash lose the most. Debt jubilee, a coordinated global cancellation of debt. This has happened before in history. It could happen again, but it requires political will to stand up to creditors or a system collapse. Defaults cascade. Banks fail. Currencies hyperinflate. A chaotic reset that destroys wealth across the board before a new system emerges. The wealthy are betting on controlled inflation. They hold assets that rise with inflation. The poor hold cash and wages that lag inflation. They bear the cost. Here's what you need to understand. The global debt system is not broken. It's working exactly as designed. It concentrates wealth. It creates dependency. It ensures the financial elite profit from the labor of everyone else. Debt is presented as a natural feature of modern economies. It's not. It's a designed system that benefits creditors at the expense of debtors. The system is maintained by central banks, protected by governments, and celebrated by economists who are funded by the institutions that profit from it. The 317 trillion in global debt is not a crisis to be solved. It's a feature to be maintained as long as possible while extracting maximum wealth. Understanding this doesn't give you a solution, but it gives you clarity. You can see the system for what it is. You can stop believing the myths that debt is necessary, that central banks are neutral, that the system serves everyone. The system serves creditors, always has, always will, until it can't anymore. Thanks for watching. If you want to keep learning how the world really works, subscribe and hit that bell. I'll see you in the next one.